Yep, thank you.
All right, great. All right, let's try that again. I'm Eldon James with the Rappahannock River Basin Commission. We have the commission chairman with us, Jason.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I think this is our third discussion on solar, maybe four. Time flies when you're having fun. This is an important topic to the basin, and I'm looking forward to the discussions today from our groups present. So welcome, everybody. I'm Jason Bellows from Lancaster County. I will be hosting the commission meeting in just next week. So hopefully I'll see some of you in person. But again, welcome today, and look forward to the discussion. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, let's go around and let folks introduce themselves. I'm gonna just use my screen as the guide. Dan Holmes.
Hi, Dan Holmes. I'm representing Piedmont Environmental Council on behalf of Weather Rock Consulting. So been involved in solar siting issues for PEC. I left the organization in April of this year, but previously served as the Director of State Policy.
Great, thanks, Dan. Next, Brent Hunsinger.
Morning, my name is Brent Hunsinger. I am Title Programs Manager with Friends of the Rappahannock.
Okay, and next let's go to Luke Peters.
Hey y'all, Luke Peters with the Berkeley Group, representing equal parts GWRC and Middle Peninsula PDC.
All right, and Dave Evans.
Good morning, with Department of Environmental Quality.
All right, and Judy Dunscombe.
Good morning, I'm Judy Dunscombe. I work for the Nature Conservancy in Virginia, based out of Charlottesville.
Thanks, Judy. Joe Lurch.
Good morning, Joe Lurch with the Virginia Association of Counties.
Okay, and Brian Johnson.
Good morning, Brian Johnson with Virginia Farm Bureau.
Very good. Julie Bolthouse.
Hi, good morning. Julie Bolthouse with Piedmont Environmental Council.
Thank you. And once we're on the PEC roll, Don McGowan. Oh, you're on mute, Don.
Sorry, Don McCowan, also with Piedmont Environmental Council.
All right. Pat Cody. Pat, you're on mute.
Seal and Associates and note taker for the Northern Virginia Conservation Trust.
Thanks, Pat. Elizabeth Andrews.
Good morning. Elizabeth Andrews, Virginia Coastal Policy Center, William and Mary Law School.
John Bateman.
John Bateman, Northern Neck Planning District Commission.
Okay. Thanks, John. Harrison Freeman.
Hi, Harrison Freeman with Culpeper County Planning and Zoning.
Lindsay Edwards.
Good morning. I'm Lindsay Edwards here with the Berkeley Group.
Sarah Holberg.
I'm Sarah Holberg, land use planning consultant based in the Shenandoah Valley.
You, Margaret Denneman.
Hi, I'm Margaret Denneman, and I'm with the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality.
Welcome, Margaret. And let's see, we've got a phone number. And I don't know if that's somebody that's already been introduced or to 571 number.
That is me. I'm sorry. I rely on my phone for audio.
Okay, very good. I think we've covered everybody, and except for Jillian.
Jillian Saul, Rappahannock River Basin Commission staff.
Thanks, Jillian. Okay, with that, we're moving on, as the chairman said, our fourth discussion on solar as we gather different perspectives. This month, our perspective is from the various conservation organizations, and Judy Dunscombe with the Nature Conservancy agreed to kind of kick this off for us. And without further ado, Judy, I'm going to hand it off to you, and tell us your very simple, non-complex perspectives on solar development.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. It'd be, am I able to share slides? Is that allowed?
We can do that. Just 1 second.
Great.
All right, you should be able to.
All righty, let's do it. Are you seeing a slide?
Yes.
Okay, groovy. It's a good start. I won the day. So good morning, everyone. Thanks, Eldon, for inviting me and to members of the Rappahannock River Basin Commission. I'm going to blast through a bunch of this. I recognize a lot of you on the call, and I fear you might recognize me. I give a number of talks about a model last year that we put forward, and that's part of the content for today, but I'm going to be talking about some more stuff. So I'm going to move pretty quickly, which means that if you have any questions, please ask. And if I don't see a hand up and somebody else does, just shout out. We can keep this very casual. So I'm going to talk about the Nature Conservancy's efforts to collaborate to achieve solar energy development without impacting critical lands. I think one of the really important things to understand is that all forms of energy development, regardless of how good they are for the climate, they have impacts. And renewable energy has a bigger footprint than typical fossil fuels do, at least if it's developed as we're currently seeing it developed under a utility model. So for us, that means that we're looking at a both and scenario. So, we're a conservation organization. It's very important to us to have protect natural areas, clean water. It's also very important to us to have renewables so that we can address climate change and provide viable path forward for a post-coal economy for a number of our coalfields communities. And these are good things that come out of renewables and the conservation work that we do. But if we focus excessively on conservation and not enough on renewable energy development, we may miss some of those economic development opportunities, and we will certainly not be able to, we will certainly continue to put more fossil fuels, combust more fossil fuels and put more CO2 in the atmosphere than we want to have happen. If we focus exclusively on driving for renewables at any cost, we're going to see landscape conversion and a host of issues that come around with that, including stormwater runoff, loss of carbon, loss of wildlife habitat, stormwater runoff. So the focus for us, and I just wanted to lay this out here to really make it clear that it's a both and scenario, is we want to avoid those negative outcomes of focusing exclusively on too much on one or the other, and really emphasize the positives that we can get if we figure out how to have these two things coexist. So that's what our collaboration is all about. Now, one of the first things we really wanted to do was to try to understand what is the scope of opportunity for solar development in Virginia, and how does that opportunity potentially conflict with other important natural resource values. So we took an extremely simple approach, looking at areas that are suitable for solar development based on their slope, their distance to transmission. We eliminated some areas that are clearly unsuitable based on their land cover, and it is a practical matter. There needs to be, enough solar developable area kind of adjacent to one another to make a viable project. So just using those really simple things. We did not consider transmission capacity, which is a huge issue. And we didn't really consider land price, although land price doesn't actually seem to be driving a lot of behavior at this point. So when we did that, this is what our model produced for us. One thing I just want to point out, in the eastern part of the state, where most of the Rappahannock River Basin is, the primary driver is distance to transmission. So if you're within, the closer you are, the better. 3 miles is sort of an outer limit at the moment. That is the primary thing that makes a project because the land is fairly flat. Because the land is fairly flat. If you move further to the west into the mountains and the coalfields region, there actually are quite a few small sites in the coalfields region that are hard to see at this, but it's really the terrain that becomes the driving factor in the western part of the state. So east, distance of transmission, west terrain. So anyway, when we ran this, we get about 8.8 million acres of potentially solar suitable land in Virginia. And I'll just say, we know that not all this is really suitable, but this is a simple model that gives us kind of a concept of what we're looking at. And we did just test our model to make sure that it was pretty good. And we found that 92% of the projects that were in the PJMQ show up within our modeled area. So we feel pretty good that our model does a good job. Might overrepresent solar area, but it doesn't, it's not wrong in the sense of predicting. It predicts well where solar is going to occur. So then what we wanted to do was look at conservation lands. And again, the Nature Conservancy is pretty focused on biological diversity, but we recognize that we share this land with ag and forestry community, with folks who are very driven by conservation of historic resources, scenic vistas, et cetera, et cetera. And so we wanted to use something as an overlay that would reflect all of those values. So we went with Conserve Virginia. There's some reasons why it's not the right layer, but it's the one that we have that represents all these values and does as good a job as anything at doing that. So when we overlay that, we found that we have about 2.2, rounding up maybe 2.3 million acres, or about a third of the area that is solar developable is also within this conservation priority, the Conserve Virginia priority area. So our takeaway from this is that there is potential conflict between solar and that's not rocket science, that there's conflict between solar and these other land uses, but there's a lot of places that aren't in conflict. And so, we just did some really quick back of the envelope math. If our model is like, we have about 6.5 million acres that comes out showing up as developable. And if our model is wrong, like let's say that we're totally wrong and we only have half that much land. We don't know exactly how much area we have to see developed for solar, but just using what's in the Virginia Clean Economy Act as a guideline, and we have about 161,000 acres, let's say it's twice that. What you can see is that even if our model is wrong and we just slash that in half, and even if we double the amount of renewables that the Virginia Clean Economy Act suggests we need, we still have nearly 10 times the land area that's outside of that conflict area. So the key message is that this is a solvable problem. We can figure this out. We have enough room to work. So a couple of approaches that we've been taking to try to figure out how to make this work. One of them is to look at solar on degraded lands. We started to evaluate opportunities on mine sites and brownfields, and I'm going to show you a couple slides from one particular site. There are some tricky things about it's harder to develop a mine land or a brownfield because there are uncertainties around what kind of substrate you're dealing with. Those are technical difficulties. So there's some proof of concept that needs to be done here, but there are a few solar developers that really do focus in on exclusively on brownfield development. They've created a niche for themselves in that. These areas tend to be smaller, on the smaller side. Right now, what's really in fashion are very large sites. I think probably most folks have heard that there's a pretty big backlog on the PJM queue. And in fact, PJM has decided, that's our grid operator, and they've actually put a temporary moratorium on any new projects coming in because they're just utterly overwhelmed. So that seems to be maybe driving the market to put in developers to put in really huge projects, because if you can get a 900 megawatt project through, it's easier than 300 megawatt projects because of the backlog. So anyway, there are mine sites and brownfields throughout the Commonwealth that that are possible. Actually, this is in the wrong spot. So, and I just want to talk here to a project that we have in Southwest Virginia where we're working with Dominion Energy, Sun Tribe, Dominion Energy and Sun Tribe to develop some lands that the Conservancy owns in Southwest Virginia. So our preserve, this is the area that the Nature Conservancy, the Highlands property, and we the first thing we did when we were looking to develop this property, and this is part of a number of these lands are previously mined areas. So we kind of zoned it based on what the desired outcomes we wanted for that land were. So anything that's sort of pink here on this map are areas where we have intact habitat and wildlife and biodiversity were really what we wanted. But anything in green are areas that we felt were ideal for solar because they're just sort of flat, reclaimed mine lands. And then we had some areas in the middle that we were willing to consider. So we've been working with our two, we have options with these two companies. They're doing the site-specific work right now to try to figure this out. And, we're really hopeful that we'll be able to get a couple of really good projects here that both are beneficial, have benefit to the community, and are able to provide us some income that we can then turn around to use for management of the conservation outcomes of the site. I think I'm going to have to back up here briefly to get to this graphic. So I just want to speak briefly, and this is an infographic that's a cartoon. We're paying somebody to make us a nice one, so I apologize. I don't have our nice infographic right now. But the idea is this: if we, through a combination of brownfield development, rooftop and distributed solar, and energy efficiency, all of those things together can sort of reduce pressure on greenfields. But there's some legislation that's happening right now, and that Dan was very active in getting passed, which requires developers to compensate, to mitigate for impacts to ag lands and forest lands above a certain number of acres. And I just wanted to put a pitch in the Rappahannock watershed. One of the things that I'm hoping this group will do when it launches is really think hard about, mitigation isn't one thing. It's a stepwise process. So the first thing you do is avoid impacts in the first place, and then you minimize the ones that you have to have. And then at the end, you do something to offset, to make up for those impacts. And one of the things that we're hoping folks will think about as something that needs to be offset is certainly wildlife and certainly stormwater, but also the carbon sequestration potential of those forests. So, and I just want to be clear that a lot of folks think that when you build solar on a site, it's automatically a net zero thing. So even if you have to clear trees, it's okay because the solar energy that's being generated there is displacing fossil fuels, and so we're good. But actually, unfortunately, with most things, as with most things in life, it's a little more complicated than that. And one of the ways in which it's more complicated is that Virginia has a goal to get to net zero, and we are really well positioned in this state to be able to get our electricity sector to zero. We can see a clear path to doing that, which is very exciting. Right now, we get about 29 million metric tons of CO2 from our power sector. We do think that by 2045, we can get that to zero. Similarly, from buildings, just the buildings that we have through building electrification, energy efficiency, a number of things, there are pathways. I'm not saying it's easy, but there are pathways that get that to zero. So yay, we have some things that we think we can really do. There are some other things where we can make great strides, but we don't think we can get them to zero. And one of those is transportation. 48%, more than half of our emissions in Virginia come from transportation. Getting that to zero is going to be very hard. Significant reduction, yes. Getting it to zero, no. And then there are industries like steel, concrete, whatever. Getting those to zero is also, we don't have practical technologies or approaches to help us get there. So what that means is if we're going to get to net zero, we need to make sure that we have something that is pulling carbon out of the atmosphere for us, so that you have a balance sheet ultimately. So if you're going to put 15 million metric tons of carbon up in the air, you got to have something that is sucking 15 million metric tons of carbon out of the air for you. And what does that? Forests do that. So the ability of those forests to remove, and ideally more than we put out, right? Because that's what we need to have happen, is a critical thing that we need to protect moving forward. So this idea of, avoiding impacts to definitely our best forests, and then thinking about how do we do things that enhance the ability, either reforestation or other things that can enhance the ability of forests to sequester more carbon over time to make up for forests that we're losing, is a really important part of this story. Okay, well, that's all I wanted to say to you. Well, it's not really, but it's all I'm going to take, all the time I'm going to take. And just again, to say that, Virginia can meet its renewable energy goals without losing our most important natural lands and the functions and values they provide to people. Joe.
Yeah, Judy, that was a great presentation. In terms of forests, I assume you're also taking into calculation the loss of carbon in the soils, and particularly like the whole mycorrhizal network, and the loss is kind of irreversible there. And then just another question somewhat on the topic overall, and maybe to the other organizations, is to get to net zero, is there any consideration of going to next generation nuclear as a possible way to get there?
Okay, soil carbon first. Soil carbon is super cryptic, like it's meaning that it's difficult to measure exactly what's going on, especially, at a landscape scale. So what I can tell you, Joe, is that particularly I know the Cornell Soils Lab has done a lot of work to look at what kind of plantings and things can be done to enhance soil carbon. So soil carbon is very important. Its role in the global carbon cycle is less well understood. It is definitely important to protect it. It can definitely be lost. It is also possible to take some management actions to help restore what's been lost. And so I'm hoping that we're going to get to talk about that on the House Bill 206 committee, some techniques for that. With regard to nuclear, the Nature Conservancy doesn't have an opinion, an official position. Having baseline nuclear production seems like kind of an important thing. So we're not in the way of it, but we don't have it's not like in our portfolio of things that we're advocating for. Dan, is that okay, Joe? Is that good? Great. Dan?
Oh. Well, let's jump to Luke. I don't know what happened to Dan.
I'm right. Sorry. Is it okay? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Go ahead.
I just had a quick question on the earlier map you showed where 92% of the projects were occurring in the area where you kind of anticipated based on your modeling. Did you go back and look at how many of those 92% are actually falling on conserved Virginia lands currently? I'm just wondering, out of that 92% that's falling in the area that you say, you kind of looked and said this is where they're going to be siting, how much of it is actually going on what the state considers its top 10% critical conservation lands?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dan. I did not do that. So I'll get you that answer. Yeah, I'll get that answer.
Luke.
Yeah, just real quick, for Cumberland Forest, was all the area that you showed also within 3 miles of a transmission line?
Yeah, yes, and it's a competitive advantage that the coalfields region has, because there's a lot of like coal prep plants and other infrastructure that already have those power lines out to them.
Okay. Other questions for Judy? Judy, I've got one, and you may have touched on it and I just missed it. You showed all those mines in Eastern Virginia, which obviously is sand and gravel. Any unique challenges with that kind of reclamation?
Yeah, I think if it's a quarry, this is one of the problems that we have with that layer, and I've talked a lot to industry about it. So if it's a quarry land, if it has inverse, if it's a hole in the ground, it's not a great place to build solar. So one of the things that's tricky is to try to make sure that those places that show up as mine sites really are viable opportunities. So not all of them are.
Okay, thank you.
But there are also, historic hard rock mines and other things that are, that are not holes in the ground. So some of those sites are viable.
Okay. With that, if there aren't any other questions for you, great presentation, Judy. Thank you. The thoughtfulness that TNC has put into this is very obvious and very helpful to hear. With that, I'm going to shift to Joe Wood.
Hold on.
Oh, yes.
I got a quick question about the map model that they used.
Go for it.
In your presentation. Can we get access to that presentation, or does that model have like detailed county maps that we could see per county?
Yes, I'm going to put in the chat a link to a webpage where we have all the different layers, and we have some county level summaries, and we have the wherewithal so that anybody can kind of make their own version of the model. So I'll put that link in the chat.
Awesome, thank you.
Hold
on real quick. This is John Bateman with the Northern Net Planning District.
Ahead,
Jason,
John.
thanks for asking that question. This is kind of something that we've wanted to do for a while, and we applied for a NIFWIF grant last year and didn't get it, to do something similar, to kind of see where the suitable sites are, in relation to suitable conservation lands. So Judy, I'll be reaching out to you via email. Thank you.
Great. Any other questions for Judy before we jump to the Bay Foundation? All right, Joe Wood, please take it away.
That's a hard act to follow. I should say, starting with that. My name is Joe Wood. I'm a scientist with Chesapeake Bay Foundation, and my general lens of focus for almost all my work is nutrients and sediment to the bay, and working on the restoration of tidal waters of the Chesapeake Bay, explicitly or mostly for Virginia. I do a little bit of work with the Bay program. I sit on the water quality goal implementation team that does a lot of TMDL work. And I'm going to kind of zoom way out and really look at this from a Bay restoration lens. And, solar is something that I think Judy described really well, as having multiple facets, and, certainly renewable energy is something that, is one of the issues of our time. But the scale at which solar development is happening is in some ways daunting when you think about addressing Bay concerns. And one of the things we've used just to kind of assess this, if you think about the current rate of progress that's happening, or the current rate of development of solar fields, it is very quickly becoming a dominant change. When you look at the watershed over time, and you think about how the watershed is changing, the development of solar is important from an acreage basis, and that has the potential to offset some of the good work that we've done. The Commonwealth's invested over $1 billion in addressing wastewater. We've got record investment in ag programs. We're really making a lot of really great progress on addressing nutrients to the bay. And dealing with a growing source is always challenging. We have a growing population. Of course, we're still building. We're still, and that's always an issue. And this adds another layer on top of that. And so, being prepared to deal with that and making sure that we can in some way offset that is really a critical approach to the future. And in some ways, I think the solar world of stormwater mirrors what we went through with development in Virginia and really across the country and other places as well. And when you think about addressing stormwater, and we look at where we are in Virginia today, one of the really difficult challenges is addressing stormwater after things are built. Retrofits are really, really expensive. And we went through a real struggle to get stormwater rules that were better in place several years ago in Virginia. And not to say that new development doesn't have any impact now, but it's not nearly what it once was. But we're still working on addressing all that development that happened before that time. And I think about that a lot when I think about solar, because I think we're in that place of having growth that has impacts that it's going to be really, really hard to go back and address. High levels of compaction. And so, in the Bay Foundation's view, getting to a place where we've got sustainable solar going in, that we're not going to have to worry about that is really a very critical piece. And so, I think there's been a lot of steps in the right direction lately, but still some more needed. And so that's kind of the lens I look at solar with, is that, we need to find a way to make sure that this landscape change that's very likely going to happen is done in a way that, doesn't completely derail all the other things we're trying to do for water and other issues. So that's kind of the level of input that I have, although I'm happy to have a discussion or conversation about any of that or further. There's one other thing I wanted to mention, because I didn't see anybody on the call that's associated with this, but the Bay program organizes, it has this branch called STAC. It's a Scientific Technical Advisory Committee, and they do workshops. And there's a workshop upcoming with Lee Daniels and David Sample and John Dignash of Virginia Tech, but also a couple of people from Penn State, looking at the question of stormwater solar issues. And I'm not sure if there'll be an opportunity to participate in those meetings, but that is a group of experts and soil scientists and stormwater engineers that are looking at this explicit question and trying to come up with recommendations of what are the opportunities in this space. So I'm happy to share the information on that if folks are interested. But yeah, I'll move to Q&A or pass it on to my colleagues here.
Joe, that would be very valuable to share that information of the STAC group, that what they're doing. I wasn't aware that they were taking a specific look at stormwater and solar. So that would be helpful to our efforts, just for sharing information. Questions for Joe? Okay, Joe, be prepared. There may be others come up as we move through the rest of this discussion today. Dan, are you ready to give us some perspective from PEC?
I think so. I'm going to see whether or not I'm technically challenged or not. Let me see if I can share my screen.
Okay, hang on. Let me authorize you to share. So hang on. Go for it.
Okay. And I probably don't have all the beautiful maps that Judy was able to share, but this will help me keep on track for the presentation. So I'm just going to I'll quickly go over, if I'm covering anything that Judy's already covered or Joe's already covered, I'll probably quickly go through it, and just add anything. I think this slide captures exactly what Judy was saying, is there is no such thing as a free lunch. If you're trying to create energy, you're going to create an impact. And some forms of generation create larger impacts than others. And each one has its own specific set of impacts that you have to look at. And with solar, yes, it's not producing carbon, but it is very highly, with utility scale solar, highly consumptive of land. So just I'm going to kind of set up a broader vision, I guess, is what I would kind of like to outline as far as where PEC is at. And a lot of this comes down to, we know this is a very consumptive land use. What can we do to reduce the total amount of land that's going to be necessary to meet our clean energy goals? And so therefore, reducing the potential for conflict with some of these natural resources that we're discussing. One of those, a part of that vision is, besides, looking at reclaimed post-industrial sites, that kind of thing, is looking at what we have available for our rooftops. And while more expensive than the utility scale version that the industry is currently presenting us. I would argue that the utility scale vision does not calculate the externalities of that choice. And if we're not accounting for the total acres of forest lost, the loss of prime agricultural soils and other things in this, then obviously it's going to be the cheaper route forward. But I would argue that we need to make sure the tally sheet is accurate, so we really know what decisions we're making. Right now, the current vision is the majority of our energy, upwards of 90% plus, will be met through utility scale solar, or utility scale projects, I should say. And many of you took a look at what a VCU grad student was able to pull together in 2021. This is just giving you a snapshot of where solar projects have occurred already. And this is, I'm just focusing on this cropland and forest number because right now that would indicate pretty good soils, and that would indicate important lands. And right now we have our current projects accounting for over 80%, or sorry, upwards of 80% of that type of coverage, you know, in important soils and forest land. We don't think that's the path forward. We'd like to see, less valuable lands being selected for these types of projects, marginal soils, and we'll get a little bit more into that as we go on. Also, just again, last pitch, we have tons of flat roof space. And the fact is that you can actually be much more dense in your panel coverage on flat roof space than you can in a utility scale model. So you're actually, achieving a much higher megawatt per acre. Again, there are expenses though related to roofs, related to service of these types of facilities, and the fact that they are oftentimes not consolidated on one piece of land. So other challenges. Judy mentioned this again. We're trying to avoid those impacts that we feel are unwarranted, minimize the impacts that we can avoid, mitigate the damage that's being done, regardless of the level of at the end of once you've gone through avoid and minimize, then you're looking at what are the impacts are left and how can we mitigate those. And ultimately, we want to see these properties, the ability to restore them back to their former use. And that's really where the rubber hits the road. I'm going to talk a lot about soils. Judy focused on forests. To us, it all starts with the soil. How and where matters. Again, I think a lot of this was covered by Judy. I do, again, highlight DG and community solar as a means to offset that the level that's needed to accomplish through utility scale. I'm going to also talk a lot about construction techniques and best practices, because right now, the current method for developing a site, I would say it doesn't have to be that way. We don't have to see the level of impact, even on a marginal site. We don't have to see the level of impact that we're currently seeing with the level of grading and compaction to the soil types that we're seeing for these projects. And obviously, meaningful decommissioning plans and restoration of the site. Looking at it from a comprehensive plan, from a locality perspective, a lot of these rural lands, we never intended them to be available for development, at least not at this time. So a lot of this is asking yourself, will that be able to be reincorporated as a part of the rural fabric moving forward? Will it ever be able to be returned back into a part of the rural economy if that project were to move away? There's also an issue of cumulative impact. I'm only going to point to Charlotte County as an example. They're getting hammered right now with proposals. Thousands of acres, tens of thousands of acres are being discussed in that area. So when you start to see that level of development, it gets bigger than just an individual project. We do think there's a cumulative impact assessment that probably needs to take place once you see that kind of clustering of projects. Specifically, when we look at that county and we look at the conserved Virginia values within it, these are some of the very high conservation lands, and they are currently being slated for solar development. Also, again, we don't think the level of compaction is necessary. We think that there should be a conversation about best management practices. And ways to reduce the level of compaction. Frankly, I don't think I'm not a big fan of grading. I've seen too much topsoil loss in that process. So, you know, I think everybody, if we could see solar panels on rolling hills, that's a much nicer look than solar panels on a completely degraded flattened site that's had 7 feet of cut and fill, 3 inches of topsoil thrown back on, establishing turf, and then calling it a day. To try to suggest that that land is going to revert back to the forest or the farmland that it was prior is laughable at best. Again, getting back into, there's also transmission impacts that needs to be considered as a part of the project. What is it going to take to interconnect this? What are the associated impacts that the locality needs to consider? And again, that decommissioning plan, you need to make sure that it is actually returning this land back to the state as much as possible that it was prior to the development. The focus here is resource considerations. And the reason why I focus on soils is because soils cannot be recreated in a lab. I'm going to look to Judy to smack me if I say anything that's offensive with regard to forest. That's not my intent. But you know, a forest, you can replant a forest. You can't recreate soils. There's no lab that I can go to and say, I want class 1 soils. Can you give me 3 truckloads? That's going to have to come from another site. So there is no mitigation of soils. That soil, that loss of that soil is the loss of that class of soil. So at the end of the day, avoiding class 1, and I would argue even class 2 soils, or some class 2 soils are worthy of consideration here. That's ensuring that those are able to, even if they're in forestry or farming right now, those, simply by having those good soils there, means that restoration of that, even to natural habitat, is still an option in the future. So it's not just about protecting the places that are pristine now. It's about having a vision that ensures that the resources that would be necessary to restore some of these landscapes are also available for future generations. And again, the biggest thing here is avoiding the best soils and minimizing disturbance and compaction on the soils, on lesser soils where development does occur. Forestal impacts, again, I do want to flag the type of forest does matter. I think all forests should be mitigated when damage is done to a certain extent. But again, I'm not going to try to argue that native mixed hardwood forest does not have a higher value than, say, a pine plantation or something along those lines. Having said that, the only value of a forest is not the carbon in the trees. They provide many other benefits, including habitat, water quality, and the like. And if I were to use the current justification that's being used for, oh, well, this, you know, by clearing this 1,000 acres and putting solar panels, it's saving us 10 times the carbon than that forest could. That's not the question here. The question is, can we achieve a win-win? Can we preserve the forest, and can we find place for the solar? There's no reason why we have to clear cut that level of forest to achieve our renewable energy goals. And I think Judy's mapping is going a long way to establishing that. Hydrological impacts, again, stormwater considerations. Many of you might have seen a recent announcement by DEQ to change how they're going to calculate stormwater. That was reeled in a bit. Matter of fact, the same language that was placed in the bill that Judy mentioned earlier, 206, was placed upon that stormwater calculation, meaning projects in the PJM by a certain date will not have to use this type of methodology for determining stormwater impacts. We can use whatever number we want to. We can use whatever calculation we want to. The point is junk in, junk out. So at the end of the day, the impact is going to be the impact. And if we're not calculating the true impact by using an inferior methodology for determining stormwater runoff calculations, then I think we're going to underestimate the impact to the Commonwealth as a whole, to local streams, and ultimately the Bay. Hydrological impacts, again, pre and post monitoring is always a question I have. A lot of concerns are coming with turbidity in streams, and we're seeing streams run brown after construction on a project. It'd be nice if some of the larger projects were able to do some pre-construction monitoring so we can have a better understanding of what level of impact we're actually facing on some of these local streams. Ecological impacts, historic, cultural, and scenic resources. The only thing I'll say there is, remember, these are primarily going to be visual impacts. screening on the outskirts of a property may or may not protect that resource. So sometimes you need to think about constructing screening, perhaps even off-site from the development, that would protect specific scenic resources or specific historical cultural resources. Give you an idea of some of the level of grading that occurs on these sites. Again, these are fairly massive projects that involve a lot of compaction, a lot of stormwater needs. So these are industrial sites. So we need to be honest with ourselves when we're considering what we're going to be putting on the landscape. Again, another example showing one project that was proposed in Culpeper. It did not get approved, but again, we're seeing this is pretty consistent with what we're seeing on many of the projects proposed in our area. When you overlay it on top of a conserved Virginia map, you'll notice that 70% plus of the paneled area is conserved Virginia values, whether that be habitat here. Matter of fact, I think there was on this particular project, inside the fence, 160 acres of habitat, 360 acres of what's considered critical floodplain or flood resilience lands, and on a cultural historic preservation, 2,200, 220 within the fenced-in area. Again, also consider though on some of these impacts, the impacts extend far beyond what's just in the fenced-in area, the project area itself, and it's really going to depend on visibility. All right, and again, scenic. This is an overlook from Luray for a project that was proposed there a few years back, and again, just trying to get an idea of what the impact would be. To give you an idea of why, sometimes there's concerns about the Conserved Virginia data layer. For scenic resources, the way Conserved Virginia handles it is 200 feet from the scenic highway or scenic overlook. So if you're able to put a wall 200 feet out from that overlook, then you won't see this. But it's a consideration for a town that relies heavily on tourism. That is one of those factors they're just really going to have to keep in mind. What is the impact to our tourism? What is the impact from the important scenic overlooks looking down into our county or into our town? I talk about co-location too. Again, not incredibly happy with the original decision that put a natural gas power plant in this area, but once it was there, surrounding that with 200 acres of solar actually made sense. So there are times where we can actually look at co-location close by to other industrialized facilities and limit the impacts to the landscape. Closing thoughts. I don't believe this is an either or choice. I do think that we can establish a policy that allows us to pursue renewable energy at the level we need and reduce the impacts greatly from the current model that we're looking at. I do think that if the idea is that we want to see greater support for solar in our future, that bad projects actually work against that. Actually seeing projects that are having major impacts with regard to stormwater, lackluster screening, impacts to important agricultural operations or forested lands, that's only going to drive opposition to these projects further. And we're hopeful that the state will begin to address some of these issues. We want to ensure that there are appropriate rules of the state, but I'm just raising the question for localities. Absent the state really taking on some of these larger impacts, right now it really is falling on the localities to make these hard decisions. And while locality is typically focused on its comprehensive plan, there are some larger impacts that would be at the state level I'd hope they take care of, but I do think that when we look at our comprehensive plans in our localities, oftentimes they speak to the preservation of our forests, our farmland, the important resources within. So really the question, so for example, HB 206 is going to require mitigation for these projects for impacts to forest and soils. Does the locality want to start looking at that? Because the state's not going to pick it up for a while. This conversation is going to go on for a little bit. We've seen the language that's in that bill, and I'm not going to be shocked if we don't see meaningful mitigation on any project until after 2028, based on the dates that are in that bill. So, being first through the gate, yes, you get some projects, but if you're not anticipating some of these impacts and not looking for appropriate mitigation at the county level, don't look to the state process to provide that for you. I really want to stress that the locality does have a lot of options here for the way the landscape is treated and for how meaningful mitigation might occur within a county border. And I hope that localities start looking at these options. Lastly, I'll just end with, we're better than this. I've been in the conservation community now for almost 25 years. I've gone through a lot of land use battles, a lot of siting conversations. I just can't believe that we cannot figure this out. I can't believe that we would not want to see us reduce the need for greenfield solar siting as a part of our policy. So a lot more work needs to be done at the state, both on the mitigation conversation coming out of 206, but also in general about what policy do we want to embrace, what is in our best interest. And with regard to climate change issues that are important to many citizens, I always feel the best path is involving the citizenry and residents of Virginia in the solution. And so empowering more Virginians to look at things like net metering, rooftop solar, community solar projects, municipal solar projects are great ways to take this burden off of some of our most precious resources. I'll stop there.
Questions for Dan?
Dan.
Go ahead.
Thanks for the presentation. That was great. Has there been any modeling on rooftop solar and whether if we basically flip the model and put 90% of our solar on rooftops, we would reach essentially our goals of net zero by doing that?
It really comes down to,
is there really enough space in the rooftop to achieve the goal that we're now putting on farmland?
No, I'm going to be blunt. There's no way we're going to reach 100% renewables without seeing some greenfield development. But my question is, what level? The current model says 90% utility scale, 10% rooftop, and other DG, does distributed generation. My question is how much of that need for greenfield can we reduce? And there's every bit of evidence to suggest that, you know, we can get upwards of 40 to 50% on rooftops and through community projects and municipal projects prior to having to look at greenfield sites. That's not factoring in as well other brownfield sites or post-industrial sites that we could utilize as well that I would consider maybe not distributed generation based on a location. That would be site specific, but at least taking advantage of an already impacted landscape and therefore reducing the impact on the greenfields. So I do believe that there is a ability for a huge policy shift on the percentages, but I don't think anybody's kidding themselves. If we're going with a full-on renewable, and heard someone mention nuclear earlier, that would obviously change the calculation depending on how the Commonwealth pursued that. But ultimately, with the current policy, we're looking at 90% utility scale projects.
One other question. You mentioned something about a 200-foot setback as some policy basis. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that, what you were referring to in that?
I was talking about as it related to scenic resources. Judy had mentioned the Conserve Virginia data layer. This is the state best ability or best attempt to try to determine what the top 10% of all the lands in Virginia that are eligible for conservation that makes sense to conserve. What is the top 10%? That's what Conserve Virginia represents. And while it's a great desktop survey for trying to determine initially, do we need to dig harder and look harder at the impact? Some of those data layers were problematic, as Judy was alluding to. Some of the more important data layers I think are pretty good, but I mentioned the fact for scenic resources, the way that they handle that is they draw a buffer around, say, scenic roads or scenic overlooks or anything like that. There's a 200-foot buffer established from that scenic road. That's what they consider scenic. Now, anybody who's driving down a scenic road knows that you're not looking at just 200 feet off the road. You're looking, off into the distance, large landscape. So again, while these are great desktop surveys to try to determine initially what the level of impact are for resources, I'm just letting everybody know that that once you have it flagged that there may be an impact, you might want to do a little bit more digging on what the particular impacts might be, depending on the layers that are being caught up in that Conserve Virginia model.
Joe Lurch.
Sorry, I had to unmute. Just something to address to Jason's question, and it's something that we've been looking at here as part of the SCC recent task force on energy storage, which is even with utility scale solar and wind, there is no guarantee we'll get to zero carbon in Virginia. And it's even spelled out in the Virginia Clean Environment, VCEA. In other words, the utilities are required to get us a stable grid. And if it can't be achieved through a combination of renewable energy and energy storage, then they'll still be able to do that. And so it does raise some questions regarding other options that still may be available. And that's why I had mentioned nuclear as an option. And it's important to note too, that it's also a capital investment that we're making as a choice. And once we've made that capital investment and those dollars are gone, so it's kind of it's an opportunity cost loss situation, and it's still trying to be figured out. It's not to say that utility scale solar is not a part of the picture, but it's not the complete answer, particularly as the storage technologies and the situation could change because of technology development, but it's currently not there. Lithium ion batteries do not have the ability to get us there. Currently, it was a modeling done by a consultant for the SCC that shows that if once we get to 50% of our baseload from renewables, lithium ion batteries will not provide the storage we need. So we need to come up with another option.
Joe and I see things very, I think we share that perspective on a lot of this. I do think there's a lot more to figure out. What I'm trying to make sure is that as I said earlier, that the tally sheets are accurate with regard to all the considerations. Because right now, I think if you leave out the externalities, things look rosier than you might think. Or the industry might, be able to present a picture that might be rosier with regard to what they're able to accomplish or not, and for what cost. What I'm saying is if we accurately capture the costs associated with each of our decisions, I do think there's a better way forward.
Yeah, and I'll just add something too that I think would be interesting to get PJM's perspective on, but we're not only doing utility scale solar in Virginia, we're doing it throughout the PJM market. And I think there's some concerns, and I've seen it in some of the IRP at least with Dominion. If other states are doing utility scale solar, are we putting too much into the grid? And are we going to be basically have plants that sit idle because they're producing too much power and there's not enough storage?
Other comments, questions? All right.
See Judy's hand. I don't know if Judy.
Go ahead, Judy.
Yeah, if I thanks, Eldon and whomever. I just to briefly kind of speak to the distributed thing. I think Dan makes a really good point, with several really good points, but one around the role of localities and potentially also entities such as the river basin, which is that the kind of guidance, the kind of sort of landscape scale guidance that is needed to really think through where to put solar isn't going to come from the state, right? It's going to have to come from the localities. And so we also are very interested in the rooftop solar model. And Dan, the number that I usually use is just, I put a link to this report in the chat. NREL's study of small rooftop suitability suggests that Virginia could account for 30% of its energy sales from, I don't forget the year, 2016 maybe. So, roughly 30% from rooftop solar. Now, there could probably be more that spoke to existing buildings, but at a minimum, 30% looks pretty good. So that is one of the ways that we can avoid the need for greenfield development. And there are multiple barriers to that, however, not the least of which is the fact that distributed generation is not consistent with investor-owned utility business model. So I believe I know that parts of the basin are actually within electric co-op territory. And so working with those electric co-ops to think through electrification scenarios or distributed generation scenarios could be a real opportunity for this basin. And I have a report that I can share. A colleague of mine did in New York for Nassau and Suffolk counties on Long Island, working with those localities to figure out where distributing, so rooftop and community scale solar could go. And I don't recall the exact number, but it was a very large proportion of those localities' energy needs that they were able to meet through that planning. So I'll share that report in the chat, just highlighting the importance of distributed and the importance of local planning and land use to create the conditions that would, I think, really advantage that over utility scale.
Yeah, and I'll just say I was giving myself a little bit of room for comfort, but I was adding community solar and municipal solar as the potential other 10 to 20% of the 50% that I said earlier. So,
Harrison, you have a question?
Yeah, just real quick. I was just wondering if anyone knows of any resources out there, like some policy guides regarding to either say localities helping assist the expansion of, let's say, distributed solar projects, or something along the lines of this solar siting for utility scale solar.
I know a lot of work has been done on the nonprofit side, and Harrison, I've put my contact information in there. You can feel free to call me. But besides work that some of the groups on here have done, I would also point. I know Shenandoah Valley. Why is it escaping me? Alliance for the Shenandoah Valley, excuse me, also has some siting resources on their website. Other than that, though, there are some things from the government and other agencies I can share with you as well. So just give me a call afterwards.
Okay, thanks. Let's see. Before we move on to Friends of the Rappahannock, a question for Dan and Judy. Virginia is building data centers like crazy. And the developers, owners behind those data centers are driving some of the solar development because they're wanting their power to be, green power. Any experience y'all are having with developers of the data centers actually putting panels on their roofs? It's something I haven't seen anything on.
Looked into that. I definitely think it's possible. How much they're able to achieve is in question. A lot of times those rooftops are used for cooling facilities. That's my understanding, but some things are happening, changes in design are happening that might allow for additional. Second thing I'll say is, from a storage standpoint, there might be opportunities, and that's something I've been looking at, is whether or not you could have on-site storage, reducing some of the impact to the rural landscape from large storage facilities associated with some of the utility scale projects. What could we be doing at the data center specifically? They oftentimes have backup generators and other things. So again, how could we make them a part of at least not, I don't think data centers are going to be a part of the solution. Let's be honest. They are huge energy hogs. Matter of fact, if you look at all things being stable over the next 20 years, we would be stable in our energy demand, but for data centers. So again, they're an active player in this conversation. Matter of fact, I can tell you Amazon weighed in heavily on the legislative discussion that we had this past session, hand in hand with the solar industry. So they definitely are a part of this conversation, and I anticipate that they'll be playing in this on this court for at least the next couple of years as we figure out what comes out of 206.
Okay, thanks, Stan. Hey, Judy, I see you posted something on a report. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, just that's the Long Island solar roadmap report that I thought might be useful for folks from a local land use planning perspective.
Thank you. Pat, you got a comment?
I just had a question of whether anyone has attempted to put together a map for the Rappahannock River Basin of proposed solar facilities and overlaid on conserve Virginia or BMP, other conservation priorities.
I'm wondering if anybody's got a answer to that, because I do not.
We've done some of that work as it relates to specific projects, but more, and I say we, I'm sorry, I'm still associating myself with my past organization, but again, representing PEC. PEC's done some of this work in the past for projects in our region. I don't think we've done it for the entire basin. And again, what I'm finding is it's sometimes hard to keep up with, you know, what projects are coming down the road too, and trying to anticipate what the impacts are going to be from that. So whenever we do these things, it's a snapshot and they change fairly quickly. However, that ability does exist.
Okay. And with that, I think we've got a segue. But before I segue, Dan and Judy, can I be sure and get Joel to share your PowerPoints? We'll post them on the technical committee site. All right. Brian cannot be with us. Brian Hoffman cannot be with us today. So pinch hitting today is Brent Hunsinger, and I'm going to hand it off to Brent for some perspective from the Friends of the Rappahannock.
Thanks, Eldon. Like he said, Brian sends his regrets for not being able to be here today. He does enjoy speaking with this group, and so he sends his regrets. I will do my best to fill in for him on short notice. So the first thing I will say regarding
I think Brent was talking, but I couldn't hear him.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Was that we are very interested in HB 206 that was passed this past General Assembly. There will be a lot of good that comes out of that, but like Dan said, that'll be a long kind of a process that plays out over time. There are two Board of Supervisors that I know in the Rappahannock watershed that will be on that work group. One of them is from King George County and one of them is from Caroline County. And judging from watching the Board of Supervisor meeting in Caroline County last night, this issue of localities grappling with solar is front and center for many of these counties as they are moving forward. So a couple of things on Friends of the Rappahannock's stance on solar, or things that we like to see included in solar projects, would be that the solar panels need to be considered impervious and that the post-construction BMPs need to reflect that. I think we all know that DEQ has decreed that to be the case recently. And it is my understanding, frankly, from the Board of Supervisors meeting last night that guidance has come out on how that should go about, and that counties are now adopting that guidance into some of their ordinances if they have a solar ordinance. Like I said, that is my understanding as of last night. Post-construction site stabilization should include native seed mixes to maximize stabilization and habitat values. That said, the panel height would then have to be at a certain level to not have the native seed mix impede in the solar function. There's a lot of good information on this. DCR has done a lot of great background work with the solar smart pollinator criteria that has been developed by DCR in the last couple of years. Erosion and sediment controls currently do not reflect the new weather patterns, basically the increase in rainfall and the intensity of rainfall that we are seeing. And we have seen that impact on some of our solar facilities that have come online. I think in Essex County is a great example of sometimes even ongoing issues with that have been had. That is just one solar facility that has had those issues. And so that those erosion and sediment controls are not properly designed right now to protect against the larger storms that we're having. So any large developments and land clearing needs to have better, more and robust erosion and sediment controls going forward during the construction process. And then very importantly, wetlands, the 100-year floodplain, and the RPA should all be off limits during solar construction for utility scale. And then for counties not subject to CBPA, FOR believes that a 100-foot overlay, buffer overlay, should occur that is akin to that RPA, and that it should remain fully vegetated at all times. So, essentially, we're looking to safeguard all critical natural resource areas for that. We're also very concerned about the loss of tree canopy due to utility scale solar. I've had many conversations with some folks at some of the counties, and they feel confused about the ability to balance, on one hand, they're being told not to, they're feeling the need to conserve tree canopy. On the other hand, they're being told we have this need for solar development. And so it's a balance that they are seeking to hold. Like I said, House Bill 206 going forward, that work group is going to be very important. Friends of the Rappahannock will be following that and providing input as we can throughout the process. Overall, we support good solar ordinances. Caroline County is an excellent example that we hold in high regard. An interesting part about that is as soon as the ordinance went into effect, many of the companies came back around and started asking for the special exemptions to that ordinance. So we really believe that we support the development of good solar ordinances and then the following of those ordinances going forward, despite some of the special exemption permits that are being sought by some of the solar companies. So that's kind of what I had to share in brief. Thank you.
Okay, questions for Brent? Comments? Observations? Okay, let me, we have, as we indicated at the beginning, we've been through 4 meetings and perspectives from the local government's perspectives, from the state agencies, from conservation community. Going forward, next week at the River Basin Commission meeting, I'm going to give a very, very brief report to the commission on what's transpired so far in this effort that the commission asked this technical committee to do at its meeting last December. Additional groups that we want to do some reach out to, property rights perspective, PJM perspective, Dominion Electric Cooperatives. I'd be interested in any other suggestions from the group here of others we should be reaching out to for our upcoming meetings in July and August, and going forward. Joe, I see you put your hand up. I don't know if that's on this topic or if you had something else you wanted to add.
Well, it's related to the presentations we got, which were great. And then as it relates to inviting the utilities and PJM, one of the things, and Judy, I thought it was great the way that you were looking at the transmission capacity. But one of the issues that I've seen in the PJM queue is there's a lot of big transmission lines in the queue to be built. And I'm seeing that probably as because these facilities can locate anywhere and the utilities have no say in it. For instance, the 800 megawatt project in Charlotte County, it doesn't matter if the capacity is there in the grid. And so I guess the question for the conservation organizations, are you concerned about new transmission lines impacting lands? And then further, when we have the utilities, could they give us a sense of this? And quite frankly, it's not even utility scale solar, but it's also the data centers too that's creating this demand as well.
We are
Joe.
absolutely concerned about transmission. I think BC has a long track record of being concerned about excess transmission lines through the region. Having said that, yeah, I do think that that's kind of what I was saying. It's not just the interconnection point for the facilities that we need to be concerned about. Some of these longer range projects, and matter of fact, you know, while oftentimes these projects are claimed to have independent utility, what we see is sometimes 3 and 4 projects that just magically create an extension cord of 230 kV to an area that they're looking to pursue. One thing that I will say is, you know, ever since the upgrade of the transmission line running from Gordonsville to Remington, Joe, you're probably familiar with this one, the 230 kV one. You know, the interest just shot through the roof right after that was done. So, you know, again, once we see a transmission line built, yeah, anywhere along that within a certain radius, I think you can expect greater interest for proposals. I'm also very concerned about nationally what's happening. For those of you who remember the National Electric Interest Transmission Corridor conversation from the early aughts of this century, you know, again, this idea that we can draw corridors and they'll have almost immediate approval for interstate lines is somewhat concerning, and that conversation's back. So, you know, if those corridors are established, it's pretty much what we saw from the last conversation. It's pretty much a free for all at that point. You know, the gate has been opened and let the project commence. So it's not just a state conversation. It's not just the local interconnection. It's the larger, you know, design at the national level. That's also going to put a lot of pressure on Virginia.
Yeah, and so Joe, just echoing some of what Dan said, but the Nature Conservancy is also very concerned about the potential for renewable energy development to justify a lot of transmission infrastructure. And while some new infrastructure may in fact be needed, that's not necessarily, the need for it is not necessarily what's going to drive it, right? Because there's profit motive for construction of it. So I do, part of PJM's job is to ensure that that there's capacity to absorb what is being generated at a site. So if there's not capacity in a line, then PJM doesn't typically allow the construction of that facility without upgrades to that line. So we have I'll just say that we have a couple things going on nationally. There's a project that we should be rolling out in the fall. The Nature Conservancy should be rolling out in the fall that looks at a lot of these questions around landscape conservation and then sort of where are preferable places for utility scale to go and what kind of upgrades to the grid infrastructure are necessary to make the development of those areas feasible, and rather than encouraging development of more green lands, green fields. And then similarly in offshore wind land, well, why would there be offshore wind land? In offshore wind territory, we're also looking at what can we do working with BOEM to think through how to have consolidated points of entry for offshore wind transmission, and even offshore cables, because that is actually a place where there's even more risk for stranded energy generation not being able to make it into the grid because it can't penetrate. So definitely on our radar, a couple things we have going on, and it's a tough subject because it's highly technical. And I think really groups like Southern Environmental Law Center that have been very consistently working with or representing the conservation interests in front of the SCC around like Dominion Energy's grid infrastructure plans are a really important part, technical experts and a really important part of this discussion in Virginia.
Thanks, Judy. Tom, you have a question?
Yes, Eldon, I was curious if you thought the commission would be interested in the revenue impacts to localities in the basin. as a potential topic?
I think that's yes. Short answer, yes. And Tom, what I'll do is I'll get with you offline on some ideas, best way to do that. Okay. All right. Other questions, comments, observations? Okay. Thank you, everybody. And we'll get the PowerPoints posted. We'll get Jill and I'll get some notes done and posted. We'll get this recording posted as with all the others. And look for some information on our next meeting, July 20, as I work through some outreach on which perspectives we're going to try to line up for that July meeting. And one more call for comments. Mr.
Just
Chairman.
say thanks to everyone again for attending today, and look forward to hopefully seeing some of you next week, Wednesday, here at the Tides Inn on beautiful Carter's Creek.
Very good.
Eldon, I do have one announcement on behalf of the Rappahannock Roundtable, if possible.
Sure, go right ahead, Brent.
So the Rappahannock Roundtable was just awarded an innovative nutrient and sediment reduction grant from NIFWIF. And then this is brand new, hot off the presses. The grant provides significant resources for Roundtable partners to support the VCAP program, which is the Virginia Conservation Assistance Program, which is cost share for erosion and stormwater on existing developed lands, if you're not familiar. Tree planting on agricultural and urban lands. And it's going to help launch the Rappahannock Healthy Watershed Initiative. That's to work with private capital carbon markets to accelerate land, water, and forest conservation and restoration. We're not going to announce it publicly yet with full details, but that'll be coming following a roundtable advisory board. And then there'll be a webinar to explain all this in further detail, but we just wanted to announce that.
Thank you, Brent. That good information. Are you going to be able to share some of that with the commission next week?
I will.
Okay, very good. Okay, thank you, everybody. Another good set of presentations. And Judy, thanks for being with us. The work y'all have done is just very, very helpful. And look forward to continuing these conversations. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you all.